Special Agent Arthur Corrigan, retired.
Ha! FBI? Right. I've had enough of your stories. You want to prove it? Stand up, get out of the chair. That's a direct order.
The sunlight of the early afternoon was warm and benign, the kind of gentle spring heat that made the mundane task of returning library books feel almost pleasant. Arthur Corrigan maneuvered his wheelchair with the practiced economy of motion that had defined his life for the past decade. The soft whir of the electric motors was a familiar sound against the backdrop of rustling leaves and distant traffic. He had positioned his modified van in a handicapped space near the book drop, a spot he used weekly. The sequence was always the same: lower the ramp, roll down, deposit the books, return to the van. It was a small, predictable rhythm in a life that had once been anything but. At 71, a retired federal agent, predictability was a luxury he had earned. He had just returned to the side of his van, the ramp still extended, when a shadow fell over him. It was sharp and sudden, blocking the warmth of the sun. A patrol car had pulled up behind him, not parallel to the curb, but at an aggressive angle, its front bumper aimed directly at his vehicle's rear quarter panel. The placement was deliberate, a territorial marking. There were no flashing lights, no siren, just the quiet crunch of tires on asphalt and the solid, definitive thud of a car door closing. Arthur paused, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair, and waited. The man who emerged was a study in controlled aggression. He was tall and broad-shouldered, filling out his dark blue uniform in a way that suggested hours spent in a gym. His movements were clipped and precise. He was in his late 30s, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched and eyes that scanned the surroundings with a restless, proprietary gaze. He didn't approach Arthur directly at first. Instead, he made a slow circle around the back of the van, his gaze lingering on the specialized ramp, the handicapped placard hanging from the rearview mirror, and finally, on Arthur himself. Arthur remained perfectly still. Decades of training had taught him the value of stillness, of letting the other person make the first and often the most revealing move. There was no greeting, no polite inquiry. The officer stopped a few feet away, his stance wide, his hand resting casually near the butt of his holstered sidearm. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but it was a clear and unambiguous statement of authority. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked. His voice was flat, devoid of curiosity, and heavy with accusation. It was a question designed to provoke, to put the recipient on the defensive. Arthur had asked similar questions himself thousands of times, though usually with more finesse. He lifted his head, his gaze meeting the officer's without challenge but also without deference. "I'm returning library books, officer." His voice was calm, gravelly with age but steady. The officer's eyes narrowed. He took another step forward, closing the distance until he was looming over the wheelchair. The space had become uncomfortably personal. "Doesn't look like you're returning books. Looks like you're just sitting here. This is a high-traffic area. We've had reports of suspicious activity." Arthur gestured subtly with his head toward the polished brass slot of the book drop, less than 20 feet away. "The books are in there now. I was just about to get back in my vehicle. I'll need to see some identification." It wasn't a request. The words were hard-edged, a command wrapped in the thinnest veneer of procedure. Arthur Corrigan understood perfectly. This wasn't about library books or suspicious activity. He had seen this countless times before. It was about power. The officer had seen a target he perceived as vulnerable, an elderly man, a disabled man, and had decided, on this quiet, sunlit afternoon, to exercise his authority. The officer had no idea that the man sitting before him had spent 30 years of his life analyzing predators, understanding their tells, and dismantling them piece by piece. He had no idea that his every move, every word, every subtle shift in posture was being recorded and filed away in a mind honed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The officer, whose name tag read D. Hess, thought he was initiating a routine display of dominance. He was wrong. He was initiating the end of his career. "Of course, officer," Arthur said, his tone even. "It's in my jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly. He narrated his movements, a habit ingrained from years of de-escalating tense encounters. In his peripheral vision, he saw a mother with 2 young children hurry past, their pace quickening as they sensed the tension radiating from the officer. As Arthur reached inside his coat, his mind was not on his wallet. It was on Officer Hess. He observed the man's breathing, shallow and from the chest, a sign of adrenaline. He noted the slight flare of his nostrils, the way his eyes refused to meet Arthur's for more than a second at a time, instead darting from the wheelchair to the van to Arthur's hands. This wasn't the calm watchfulness of a professional assessing a situation. This was the jittery energy of a bully searching for a pretext. Hess was looking for a reaction. He wanted fear or anger or confusion. Arthur would give him none of those. He retrieved his wallet and extracted his driver's license, holding it out. Hess didn't take it immediately. He let Arthur's hand hang in the air for a few moments, another small, calculated assertion of control. Finally, he snatched the card from Arthur's fingers. Hess studied the license for an unnecessarily long time, his lips moving silently as he read the name. Arthur Corrigan. He said the name aloud as if it were an alias he was seeing through. He looked from the photo to Arthur's face and back again. The photo was 10 years old, showing a man with fewer lines on his face, but the same piercing, intelligent eyes. "You live on Crestview Drive?" "That's correct," Arthur replied. "That's a nice area," Hess said, a subtle insinuation in his tone. "What's someone like you doing in a place like that?" The unspoken question hung in the air. He handed the license back, but he didn't step away. The invisible wall of his presence remained. "What happened to you?" He gestured vaguely toward Arthur's legs, his gaze filled with a cold, clinical curiosity that bordered on disgust. This was the moment the encounter shifted. It was no longer a matter of procedure, however flimsy. It had become an interrogation of his very existence, of his right to be there, disabled, in public. Arthur's training screamed at him to remain dispassionate, to provide short, factual answers. But another part of him, the part that had fought for dignity his entire life, bristled. "I sustained an injury," he said, his voice clipped. "What kind of injury?" Hess pressed, his tone demanding. "I don't believe that's relevant to me returning library books, officer." A flicker of something, triumph, crossed Hess's face. He had found the button. He had elicited a response that wasn't pure compliance. "I'll be the judge of what's relevant," he said, his voice dropping a notch, becoming more menacing. "I ask you a question, you answer it. It's that simple. Now what happened?" Inside Arthur's mind, a cold, clear process was unfolding. He was cataloging every detail. The time, 2:17 p.m., the location, the west parking lot of the Oak Ridge Public Library, the officer's name, D. Hess, the nature of the stop, pretextual, the escalating pattern of questioning from procedural to personal and irrelevant. He could feel the small, circular lens of the body camera on Hess's uniform, a silent, impartial witness. Hess seemed to have forgotten it was there, or perhaps he was so confident in his control of the narrative that he didn't care. "It was a service-related injury," Arthur stated, offering a piece of information he had hoped to withhold. It was a concession, a small offering to de-escalate. But for a man like Hess, a concession was not a step toward resolution. It was a sign of weakness to be exploited. "Service? What, you trip over a mop handle at the post office?" he sneered. The insult was so juvenile, so transparent in its attempt to provoke, that Arthur almost felt a detached sense of pity for the man. Almost. Instead, a cold resolve settled in his chest. He had given the officer a chance to step back. The officer had chosen to step forward. The choice was made. The sneer on Officer Hess's face lingered. He had thrown a verbal punch and was waiting for it to land, anticipating a flash of anger or a stammered defense. He was met with neither. Arthur Corrigan's expression remained unchanged, his gaze steady. The absence of the expected reaction seemed to agitate Hess further, as if Arthur's composure was a personal affront. "Let me be more specific, Mr. Corrigan. Hess said, drawing out the name with mocking formality. What I mean is, you don't look disabled. The word struck with the force of a physical blow, yet Arthur's face betrayed nothing. This was a line he had heard before in different forms from different people, the ignorant, the curious, the cruel. But hearing it from a law enforcement officer, a man whose duty was to protect, not to judge and demean, carried a different weight. It was an assault not just on his person, but on his reality, on the years of pain and rehabilitation that had led him to this chair. And what, in your professional opinion, does disabled look like, officer? Arthur asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Hess was emboldened by the question, mistaking Arthur's calm for weakness. I've seen it all, he declared, puffing out his chest slightly. Guys in chairs who can run a marathon when they think no one's looking. People with bad backs who are out roofing houses the next day. It's a scam. A way to get benefits, get sympathy, get the best parking spots. His eyes swept over Arthur's body, a contemptuous appraisal. You look fine to me. A little old, maybe, but you're sitting up straight. Your arms look strong enough. Every word was a small, sharp blade. Hess was no longer just a cop on a power trip. He was voicing a deep-seated, ugly prejudice. He saw the wheelchair not as a tool of mobility, but as a prop in a potential fraud. He saw Arthur not as a citizen, but as a suspect in a crime that hadn't even been committed. My physical condition, Arthur said, enunciating each word with cold precision, is documented, verified, and not a subject for public debate, especially not with an officer who has detained me without cause. The mention of detained and without cause visibly irritated Hess. His jaw tightened. He had wanted to remain in the gray area of a consensual encounter, a space where his power was absolute and the citizen's rights were ambiguous. Arthur had just dragged him into the black and white of legal terminology. You are not being detained, Hess snapped, his voice rising. You are being questioned as part of an investigation into suspicious activity, an investigation that is ongoing, and right now your evasiveness is making you look very suspicious. It was a classic circular piece of logic used by bullies in uniform everywhere. I'm stopping you because you're suspicious, and if you question why I'm stopping you, that makes you more suspicious. Arthur knew there was no winning a debate with this man. Arguing would be pointless. It would be recorded by the body camera as argumentative or uncooperative. Protesting would become agitation. He had to let Hess build his own cage, word by word, action by action. I have identified myself, officer, Arthur said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the churning sea of Hess's hostility. I have answered your relevant questions. I have a handicapped placard legally displayed in my vehicle. There is no basis for this interaction to continue. Hess let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. You don't decide when it's over. I do. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, menacing whisper. And I'm not convinced. I think you're faking it. It was a direct accusation, a gauntlet thrown down in the quiet library parking lot. He was daring Arthur to react, to give him the physical pretext he so clearly craved. Arthur simply held his gaze, a silent promise hanging in the air that this would be a day Officer Hess would never forget. The accusation, I think you're faking it, hung in the air, thick and poisonous. For Officer Hess, it was the ultimate move, a direct challenge to Arthur's integrity and his very identity. He expected an explosion of outrage, a sputtering defense that would confirm his suspicions of guilt and agitation. What he got was silence. Arthur Corrigan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held the officer's gaze, and in that moment, a subtle shift occurred. The persona of the mild-mannered elderly retiree fell away, and for a split second, Hess found himself looking into the eyes of someone else entirely, someone colder, more analytical, and utterly unintimidated. It was the look of a man who had faced down murderers, terrorists and traitors without blinking. The look of a man who had carried a badge and a gun in service of his country for over 30 years. "Let me tell you something about my service-related injury, officer," Arthur said, his voice still low but now resonating with a new, hard authority. "It didn't happen when I tripped over a mop. It happened on a cold morning in a warehouse in Baltimore. My team was executing a no-knock warrant on a suspect in a domestic terrorism case. He was waiting for us. He opened fire with an automatic weapon through the door." Hess's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the rambling, defensive story he had expected. "Two of my colleagues were hit," Arthur continued, his eyes locked on Hess, seeing not the officer but the memory. "I took 2 rounds in my lower back. They shattered my L4 and L5 vertebrae. The only reason I'm not paralyzed from the waist down is because of a surgeon who spent 14 hours putting my spinal column back together with titanium rods and screws. I spent the next 18 months learning how to walk again, and when it became clear I would never again be fit for field duty, I retired." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet space between them. "I didn't get this wheelchair as a benefit. I earned it. Every single day for the rest of my life, I earn it." The story, delivered with such dispassionate, factual brutality, momentarily stunned Hess. He had been expecting a lie, an exaggeration. He had not been expecting a detailed, verifiable account of profound trauma. But his ego, the driving force behind the entire encounter, refused to yield. It scrambled for a way to reassert dominance. "That's a nice story," Hess scoffed, though the conviction in his voice was noticeably weaker. "Anyone can make up a story. You watch too many movies, old man." Arthur took a calm, deep breath. He had given Hess the truth. The officer had rejected it. Now it was time for the fact that would change everything. "It wasn't a movie, officer. It was my job," Arthur said. He held up the hand that had previously held his wallet. "The agency I worked for doesn't get featured in many movies. We tend to prefer it that way." Hess narrowed his eyes, suspicious. "And what agency was that?" Arthur Corrigan looked directly at the officer, at the badge pinned to his chest, at the gun on his hip, at the swagger built on a foundation of unearned authority. And he delivered the final, fatal blow to Officer Hess's afternoon and to his career. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said simply. "Special Agent Arthur Corrigan, retired." For the first time since he had stepped out of his patrol car, Officer Dean Hess was completely silent. The smug confidence drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then a dawning, sickening wave of realization. He had not been harassing some random, helpless old man. He had been threatening, insulting, and abusing a retired G-man, a man who knew the law better than he did, a man who knew people in places Hess couldn't even imagine. The body camera on his chest, which he had all but forgotten, suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. In that moment of shocked silence, Hess understood. He had made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. The silence that followed Arthur's revelation was profound. It stretched for 3, maybe 4 seconds, but in that span of time, the entire dynamic of the confrontation inverted. Officer Hess's face was a canvas of warring emotions, shock, denial, and the pale beginnings of genuine fear. He had built this entire encounter on the assumption of his own superiority and Arthur's powerlessness. That assumption had just been obliterated. But a cornered animal is a dangerous one. Hess's training, what little of it was based on de-escalation, was overridden by a primal, desperate need to regain control. His mind refused to accept the reality of his mistake. He saw Arthur's statement not as a fact to be processed, but as a challenge to be crushed. He fell back on the one thing he had left, his physical authority. "FBI?" Hess repeated, and this time his laugh was not mocking but brittle and defensive. "Right, and I'm the director of the CIA. You think throwing out a big name like that is going to scare me?" He was talking more to himself than to Arthur, trying to convince himself that he was still in charge. He took a step back, creating a small amount of distance, and his gaze fell upon the wheelchair as if it were the source of all his problems. His mind, scrambling for a way to disprove Arthur's claim and revalidate his own authority, seized on the most cruel and direct method possible. "You know what? I've had enough of your stories," Hess declared, his voice loud and strained. "If you're so tough, if you're telling the truth, then let's see it. Stand up." The command was so absurd, so fundamentally malicious, that it took Arthur a moment to process it. He had expected denial. He had expected a clumsy retreat. He had not expected this. "I can't stand up without assistance, officer. That's the nature of my injury. That's why I am in this chair." "I don't want excuses," Hess snarled, jabbing a finger toward him. "I want to see you stand up. Get out of the chair, right now. That's a direct order." Arthur looked at the man and saw the desperation in his eyes. Hess knew, on some level, that he was done. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He was doubling down on his error, compounding a violation of policy with an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty. This was the point of no return. "Officer," Arthur said, his voice taking on a tone of finality, the voice he had once used to give a suspect one last chance to surrender. "You are giving me an unlawful order, an order you know I cannot physically comply with. I advise you to reconsider." The word unlawful was like a spark on gasoline. Hess's face flushed a deep red. To be lectured on the law by the man he was trying to intimidate was the ultimate humiliation. "I'm the law here," he shouted, his voice cracking. A woman getting out of her car several rows away stopped and stared. "And I'm telling you to get up. Prove you're not lying to a police officer." The scene had become a spectacle. Hess was no longer in control of himself, let alone the situation. He was being driven by pure, frantic ego. He had created a reality where Arthur's inability to stand was proof of his deception, and he was determined to see it through. "This interaction is over, officer," Arthur stated calmly. "If you touch me or my property, it will be considered assault." That was the final trigger. The threat of being held accountable, combined with the shame of being seen for what he was, pushed Hess over the edge. His face hardened into a mask of rage. "Oh, we're not over," he hissed, his hand balling into a fist at his side. "We're just getting started." He took a deliberate step toward the wheelchair, his eyes gleaming with a terrible mixture of fury and fear. He had been given every opportunity to walk away. Now, he was about to cross a line from which there was no coming back. The air crackled with imminent violence. Officer Hess closed the remaining distance to Arthur's wheelchair, his body radiating a palpable heat of pure rage. His training, his duty, the law itself, all of it had been consumed by the singular, desperate need to win this confrontation. Arthur didn't flinch. He watched Hess's eyes, saw the decision being made behind them a fraction of a second before the man's body moved. Hess didn't throw a punch. He did something that was, in its own way, more insidious and violating. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the handles on the back of Arthur's wheelchair. The worn leather grips, which Arthur's own hands had held for years, were suddenly in the grasp of his tormentor. "Let's see how disabled you really are," Hess gritted out through clenched teeth. And then he shoved. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a hard, violent jerk designed to unbalance and terrify. The wheelchair, which weighed over 300 pounds with its batteries and motors, lurched forward a few feet before one of the front casters caught on a crack in the asphalt. The chair twisted violently to the left. For a healthy person, it would have been jarring. For Arthur, it was agony. The sudden, shearing motion sent a bolt of white-hot fire up his spine, right at the point where flesh and bone met titanium. The network of delicate, scarred nerves screamed in protest. An involuntary gasp escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. His hands, which had been resting on his lap, flew out to grab the wheels, trying to stabilize himself as the world tilted precariously. The officer's body camera, mounted squarely on his chest, captured it all in pristine, high-definition clarity. It recorded the grimace of effort on Hess's face. It recorded the lurch of the wheelchair. It recorded the flash of agony on Arthur's face and his instinctive, desperate grab for stability. It recorded the metallic groan of the chair's frame as it was subjected to a force it wasn't designed to handle. "Stop!" Arthur managed to get the word out, his voice strained. "You're hurting me!" But Hess was lost in his own red mist of fury. He gave the chair another shorter shove, this one punctuated with a grunt of exertion. "What's the matter, FBI? Can't handle a little push?" he taunted, his voice a low, ugly snarl. The second shove, though less forceful, sent another wave of nausea and pain through Arthur's body. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting to stay conscious, to keep the world from dissolving into a gray haze. This was no longer harassment. This was physical assault under color of law, a serious federal crime. Hess, in his blind rage, had just handed Arthur the entire case, gift-wrapped and tied with a bow. The sound of a car door slamming nearby broke the spell. The woman who had been watching from a distance was now standing by her car, her cell phone held up, clearly recording. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "Leave him alone! What are you doing?" Hess froze, his hands still on the wheelchair handles. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wild. Seeing the phone, seeing the witness seemed to penetrate the fog of his anger. The dawning horror of what he had just done began to creep into his expression. He had crossed the line. He had done it in broad daylight, in a public place, in front of a witness, and with his own camera documenting every criminal second of it. He snatched his hands back from the wheelchair as if the handles were red hot. He took a stumbling step backward, his mind racing, trying to find a way to undo the last 30 seconds. But it was impossible. The act was done. The evidence was recorded. The line had been irrevocably crossed. The sight of the citizen with the recording cell phone was like a bucket of ice water thrown on Officer Hess. The rage that had clouded his judgment evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp panic of self-preservation. He looked from the witness back to Arthur, who was now breathing heavily, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his hands gripping his wheels in a white-knuckled clench. Hess's mind, trained not in de-escalation but in narrative control, went into overdrive. He had to reframe what had just happened. He had to create a version of events where his actions were justified. He raised his hand to the radio microphone on his shoulder, his movements suddenly jerky and unnatural. "Dispatch, 2L15, he said, his voice a half-octave higher than usual, strained with manufactured urgency. "I need backup. Code 3, Oak Ridge Library, West Parking Lot." "2L15, what's the nature of the situation?" the calm, professional voice of the dispatcher replied. Hess's eyes were locked on Arthur, but he wasn't seeing a man in pain. He was seeing the subject of his report. He was building his lie, live on a recorded channel. "I have a non-compliant subject, male, 70s. Subject is becoming aggressive, refusing lawful orders." Arthur listened to the transmission, a sense of detached disbelief washing over him. Aggressive? Non-compliant? He hadn't moved from his chair. He hadn't raised his voice. The only aggression, the only violence, had come from Hess. "He's making furtive movements," Hess continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his fiction. "Subject claimed to have a weapon earlier in the encounter." That was the most egregious lie of all. Arthur hadn't mentioned a weapon, hadn't gestured, hadn't done anything to suggest a threat. Hess was invoking the magic words that every cop knew could justify almost any level of force. He was creating a phantom threat to excuse his very real assault. "The man is in a wheelchair! He hasn't done anything!" the witness shouted from across the lot, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. Hess ignored her. He unclipped the microphone from his shoulder and held it closer to his mouth, turning slightly away as if to shield his words. "Dispatch, be advised, subject may be attempting to access something from within his vehicle. He's associated with a blue van, handicapped plates." He was painting a picture for the responding officers, creating a scene that would have them arriving with their hands on their guns, expecting a dangerous, unpredictable felon. Arthur slowly, painfully straightened himself in his chair. He had to remain calm. He had to let Hess talk. Every lie the officer told was another nail in his own coffin. The radio transmissions were recorded. The body camera was recording. The witness was recording. Hess was burying himself under an avalanche of his own fabrication, and he didn't even realize it. "Officer," Arthur said, his voice raspy with pain but clear and firm. "You know that what you're saying is false. There is no weapon. There is no threat." Hess spun back around, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You shut your mouth! Don't you move! Don't you move a muscle!" he yelled. He was performing now, playing the part of the brave officer controlling a dangerous situation for the benefit of the microphone and anyone who might be listening. He began pacing back and forth in the small space between the patrol car and the van, a caged tiger of his own making. He had escalated a simple, unnecessary stop into a physical assault, and now he was escalating that assault into a major incident requiring multiple units. He had lost control of the initial encounter and was now desperately trying to regain it by creating a crisis so large that his own actions would be seen as a necessary response rather than the cause. The wail of a distant siren began to cut through the afternoon air, growing steadily closer. Help was coming, but it wasn't for Officer Hess. It was for the lie he had just told. The siren grew from a distant cry to a piercing shriek in under a minute. A second patrol car screeched into the parking lot, coming to a halt a safe distance away, its emergency lights painting the scene in frantic, silent strokes of red and blue. The driver's side door opened, and a younger officer stepped out. Her name tag read S. Miller. Officer Sarah Miller was 28 years old and had been on the force for 3 years. She was sharp, observant, and had quickly learned to read a scene before rushing into it. The scene she was reading now made no sense. The radio call had been for an aggressive, non-compliant subject, possibly armed. What she saw was her colleague, Dean Hess, pacing frantically, his face flushed and beaded with sweat. She saw an elderly man in a wheelchair looking pale and in obvious pain. She saw a civilian woman standing 20 yards away with a phone held up, and she saw a handicapped accessible van. Nothing about this picture matched the report of an imminent threat. "Dean, what's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative as she approached. She kept her eyes moving, scanning Arthur, the van, the surroundings. "He's not complying, Sarah," Hess said, his voice tight and defensive. "Refused to identify himself, started making threats, telling me he's some kind of fed. He's been trying to get something from his van." Miller's gaze shifted to Arthur. He didn't look threatening. He looked like he was trying very hard not to pass out. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair, not reaching for anything. "Sir," she said, addressing Arthur directly, her tone respectful. "Are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Before Arthur could answer, Hess cut in. "Don't talk to him. He's the suspect." Miller turned her head and gave Hess a look, a quick, sharp glance that told him to stand down. It was a look that junior officers rarely give senior ones, but the situation clearly called for it. She turned back to Arthur. "Sir?" she repeated gently. "Your partner," Arthur said, his voice low and strained, "assaulted me. He shoved my chair. I believe he may have re-injured my back." Miller's eyes widened slightly. She looked at Hess, then at the wheelchair, then back at Arthur. His story, as shocking as it was, fit the visual evidence far better than Hess's frantic tale of a dangerous suspect. She could see the slight, unnatural angle of the wheelchair's front caster, still caught in the crack of the pavement. "That's a lie," Hess blustered. "He was trying to roll his chair at me. I had to defend myself. I used a control technique to stop his advance." Miller stared at him. The idea of a 71-year-old man in a wheelchair advancing on a fit, armed police officer in a way that required a physical control technique was patently absurd. She had worked with Hess enough to know his reputation. He had a short fuse and a history of escalating minor incidents. She had always dismissed it as departmental gossip. Now she was seeing it firsthand. She keyed her own radio microphone. "Dispatch 2L20, be advised the scene appears to be stable. Have a supervisor respond to our location. Non-emergency." Hess's head snapped toward her, his face a mask of betrayal. "What are you doing? I called for backup. And I'm calling for a sergeant, Dean, she said, her voice dropping, taking on a cold, professional edge. Because nothing about this adds up. She took a step toward Arthur, creating a physical barrier between him and Hess. Sir, don't move. We're going to get this sorted out. An ambulance is on its way. I don't need an ambulance, Hess protested, his panic rising. An ambulance meant an injury report. An injury report meant an investigation. It's not for you, Dean, Miller said without looking at him. Her focus was on Arthur, her expression a mixture of professionalism and a dawning, horrified understanding. She was no longer just a responding officer. She was now a witness. Hess had wanted backup to support his lie. Instead, he had gotten an audience who could see the truth. Less than 5 minutes later, a supervisor's SUV rolled silently into the parking lot. It parked behind both patrol cars, a clear and commanding position. The doors opened and Sergeant Marcus Thorne stepped out. Thorne was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man whose calm demeanor belied a sharp, analytical mind. He was unflappable, and his presence immediately lowered the temperature of the scene. His eyes took in everything in a single, sweeping glance. Hess, flushed and agitated. Miller, standing guardedly near the wheelchair. The civilian witness, still recording, and Arthur Corrigan, the epicenter of the chaos, who looked like a man enduring great pain with immense discipline. Talk to me. What do we have? Thorne's voice was deep and even, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had defined the last 10 minutes. Hess immediately launched into his well-rehearsed fiction. Sarge, I've got a subject here who was acting suspiciously. Refused to ID, became belligerent, claimed he was FBI. He made furtive movements. I perceived a threat. He tried to advance on me in the chair, and I had to use a minimal amount of force to control the situation. Thorne listened to the entire monologue without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Hess was finished, Thorne didn't look at him. He looked at Miller. Officer Miller, what did you observe upon arrival? Miller stood up straight, her professionalism a shield. I arrived to find Officer Hess in a verbal confrontation with the subject, sir. The subject, she nodded toward Arthur, appeared to be in distress. He stated that Officer Hess had shoved his wheelchair, causing him pain. I observed the citizen witness, she gestured with her head, recording the incident. My assessment was that the scene did not match the initial radio report of an aggressive subject, so I requested your presence. Thorne nodded slowly, processing the two conflicting reports. One was frantic, self-serving, and filled with jargon. The other was calm, factual, and observational. He walked over to the witness. Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Thorne. Do you mind if I ask what you saw? The woman, though nervous, spoke clearly. That officer, she pointed at Hess, was yelling at the man in the wheelchair. He was mocking him. Then he shoved the chair, hard, twice. The poor man cried out in pain. I started recording right after that. Thorne thanked her, and then finally he walked over to Arthur. He crouched down slightly, not to be condescending, but to put himself on eye level. It was a small but significant gesture of respect. Sir, my name is Sergeant Thorne. Can you tell me what happened from your perspective? Arthur took a moment, his breathing still labored. He looked at the sergeant and saw something he hadn't seen in Hess: professionalism. He saw a man who was there to gather facts, not to impose his will. Sergeant, Arthur began, his voice steady despite the pain. Your officer, Officer Hess, stopped me without cause as I was returning to my vehicle. He questioned my disability, insulted me, and ordered me to perform an action, standing, that I am physically incapable of. When I refused the unlawful order, he physically assaulted me by shoving my wheelchair, causing me significant pain. Thorne listened, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. He had been a cop long enough to know the ring of truth when he heard it. The stories from Miller, the witness, and Arthur were consistent. Hess's story was the outlier. He stood up and turned to Hess, his expression now cold. Officer Hess, is your body camera active? Hess swallowed hard. Yes, Sarge. Did you at any point turn it off during this encounter? No, Sarge. Good, Thorne said. He looked back at Arthur, a hint of apology in his eyes. "Sir, an ambulance is on its way to check you out. I assure you we will be conducting a full and thorough investigation into this matter." Arthur Corrigan knew that a full and thorough local investigation could often mean a long, drawn-out process that ended with a quiet exoneration. He had seen it happen 100 times. He needed to ensure this was different. He had one more card to play, a card he hadn't wanted to use. But Hess's actions and Thorne's professionalism had created the perfect moment. The paramedics arrived, their movements efficient and professional. They began their assessment of Arthur, asking him about his pain levels, his medical history, and the nature of the incident. Arthur answered their questions concisely, his mind still working, calculating his next move. Sergeant Thorne had stepped away to speak with Officer Miller, his back to Arthur, while Hess stood by his patrol car, isolated and stewing in a toxic mix of fear and indignation. This was the critical juncture. The situation was contained, but its future direction was not yet set. It could be handled internally, a black mark on Hess's record, a quiet civil settlement, or it could become something else entirely. Arthur had spent his life understanding the levers of power, and he knew that the right word, spoken to the right person at the right time, could move mountains. As the paramedics prepared to load him onto a stretcher for transport to the hospital, Arthur called out, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Sergeant Thorne?" Thorne turned, his expression one of patient professionalism. "Yes, Mr. Corrigan." "There's something you should know," Arthur said. "When you write your report, you'll need to make a few notifications. Given my prior employment and the nature of this incident, it's going to draw federal interest." Thorne nodded. "I understand, sir. Given your statement that you're retired from the FBI, will—" Arthur interrupted him, not rudely, but with a quiet insistence. "It's more than that, Sergeant. There's a specific person who will need to be made aware. A formality, you understand, for the paperwork." Thorne walked a few steps closer, his interest piqued. "And who would that be?" Arthur held the sergeant's gaze. He wasn't being threatening or arrogant. He was stating a fact, a piece of procedural information that he knew would change the entire equation. He chose his words carefully, letting them land with the weight of undisputed truth. "My old partner from the Baltimore field office. We came up through the bureau together. He's the current deputy director, Michael Jennings. I'm sure he'll want to be kept in the loop." The name hung in the air. Deputy Director Michael Jennings. It wasn't just a name, it was a symbol of the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. It was a name that could make police chiefs and district attorneys stand up a little straighter. Sergeant Thorne's professional mask didn't slip, but Arthur, a master at reading micro-expressions, saw it all. The fractional widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible intake of breath, the sudden absolute stillness of his posture. In that instant, Thorne understood that this was no longer a local IA matter. This was no longer about one of his officers having a bad day. This had just escalated to a level far beyond his pay grade. He wasn't just dealing with a retired agent, he was dealing with a personal friend of the second most powerful man in the FBI. Thorne recovered in a heartbeat. "I see," he said, his voice now carrying a new note of gravity. "Thank you for that information, Mr. Corrigan. I will be sure to pass it along." He turned and looked at Officer Hess, and for the first time, Hess saw something in his supervisor's eyes that truly terrified him. A look of finality, as if he were looking at a ghost. As the paramedics lifted the stretcher, Arthur knew the chain of events was now in motion. The local police department had lost control of the narrative. He hadn't needed to shout or make threats. He had simply provided a name that, in certain circles, had the power to stop time and change the course of a man's life forever. For Officer Dean Hess, time had just run out. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed overhead, a sterile and monotonous sound. After a series of X-rays and a thorough examination by a doctor, the diagnosis was confirmed. Severe muscle spasms and aggravated inflammation around the old spinal injury site. It was painful but not permanent. They gave him a prescription for muscle relaxants and anti-inflammatories. The entire time, Arthur was methodical. He ensured every bruise was photographed. Every statement he made to the medical staff was noted in his chart, and he obtained a copy of the initial medical report before he was discharged. He knew that in the battle to come, documentation was ammunition. From a quiet corner of the hospital waiting area, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, a sharp civil rights attorney he had known for years. He recounted the events of the afternoon with the dispassionate clarity of an agent dictating a field report. No emotion, just facts, times, and quotes. His lawyer listened, the silence on the other end of the line punctuated only by the furious scratching of a pen. When Arthur was done, the lawyer said only 4 words. "Don't talk to anyone." The second call was more personal. He dialed a number he knew by heart, a private line that bypassed secretaries and assistants. It was answered on the second ring. "Mike," a familiar voice said, warm but instantly alert. "Mike, it's Art," Arthur said. "Sorry to bother you on your direct line." "Art, never a bother. Is everything all right? You sound tired." Arthur gave his old friend the abridged version of the afternoon's events, again sticking to the facts, but this time allowing a hint of the weariness he felt to creep into his voice. He wasn't calling to ask for a favor. He was calling to inform. Both men understood the protocol, the invisible lines of conduct. "I see," Deputy Director Michael Jennings said when Arthur had finished. The 2 words were laden with a cold fury that only someone who knew him well could detect. "And you have the officer's name and department?" "Officer Dean Hess, Oak Ridge Police Department. There were witnesses, multiple cameras." "Good," Jennings said. "You focus on getting better, Art. Let me worry about the paperwork. The right people will be notified." The call ended. Arthur knew what those words meant. The right people were not in the Oak Ridge Police Department. They were in the Public Integrity section of the Department of Justice. Miles away, in the hushed, tense atmosphere of the Oak Ridge Police Station, Officer Dean Hess sat at a computer terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Sergeant Thorne had ordered him back to the station and told him to write up his incident report immediately. Thorne's face had been a mask of stone. "Write down exactly what happened, Hess. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." But Hess was not writing what happened. He was writing what he wished had happened. He was engaged in the second battle of the day, the battle of the official narrative. His fingers began to click and clack across the keyboard, weaving a tapestry of lies. Subject was evasive and hostile from the first moment of contact. "I observed furtive movements toward the vehicle, consistent with concealing or retrieving a weapon." Subject made verbal threats, referencing connections to federal agencies in an attempt to intimidate. "When I attempted to secure the scene for my safety, the subject used his wheelchair as a battering ram, rolling it aggressively toward my person. I utilized an approved open-hand control technique to redirect the subject's momentum and neutralize the immediate threat, using minimal force necessary." He wrote for over an hour, carefully choosing his words, peppering the report with departmental jargon and legal buzzwords to create a patina of professionalism. He described Arthur as agitated and himself as calm and professional. He painted a picture of a dangerous, unstable man and a brave officer who had narrowly avoided injury through quick thinking and proper training. He clicked Submit, sending his fabricated report into the system. He felt a small sense of relief. It was his word, a sworn officer's report, against that of an old man. In his experience, that was a battle he usually won. He had no idea that a silent federal current was already moving, and that his carefully crafted report was about to be compared, frame by frame, against the unblinking eye of his own camera. The day after the incident, the Oak Ridge Police Department began its internal process. Sergeant Thorne filed his supervisor's report, which included the witness statement, Officer Miller's observations, and a summary of Arthur Corrigan's allegations, including the name of Deputy Director Michael Jennings. The file landed on the desk of an internal affairs lieutenant. The process was designed to be slow and methodical. Officer Hess was placed on administrative desk duty pending the outcome of the investigation, a standard procedure. To the outside world, and even to many within the department, it seemed like business as usual. But far away from the quiet suburban police department, a different process was unfolding, one that moved with the silent, unstoppable force of a deep-sea current. Deputy Director Jennings had made one phone call. That call went to the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. The conversation was brief and professional. Names, dates, and badge numbers were exchanged. Within hours, a formal request citing federal statute 18 U.S.C. paragraph 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, was transmitted from the DOJ to the U.S. Attorney's Office in that state. The U.S. Attorney, in turn, contacted the special agent in charge of the local FBI field office. A new case file was opened. It was not an inquiry or a review. It was a full-fledged federal criminal investigation. The first official act of that investigation was a letter dispatched to the chief of the Oak Ridge Police Department. The letter was polite, formal, and non-negotiable. It requested that the department immediately forward all materials related to the incident involving Officer Dean Hess and Arthur Corrigan. This included all incident reports from all involved officers, all dispatch recordings, GPS data from the patrol cars, and, most importantly, the unedited raw footage from Officer Hess's body camera and the dash camera of Officer Miller's vehicle. The letter also requested that the department cease its own internal investigation and defer to the federal inquiry to avoid jurisdictional complications. The police chief, a man who had planned on a quiet week, read the letter and felt a cold pit form in his stomach. The FBI and the DOJ were not asking, they were telling. This was no longer his problem to manage. It was a federal case that had landed squarely in his lap. He immediately gave the order to comply. The digital files were uploaded to a secure federal server before lunch. While Hess was organizing paperwork at his desk, confident that the IA process would drag on for months before ultimately clearing him, a team of federal agents and a paralegal from the U.S. Attorney's Office were already gathered in a sterile conference room. They weren't interested in departmental politics or an officer's service record. They were interested in evidence. They uploaded Hess's incident report onto one screen. On a large, high-definition monitor next to it, they loaded the body camera footage. The paralegal sat at a laptop, ready to create a time-stamped transcript of the video. The lead agent clicked play. The video flickered to life, showing the view from Hess's chest. The first image was the interior of his patrol car. Then the door opened, and the camera panned across a sunlit parking lot, finally settling on an elderly man in a wheelchair next to a blue van. The audio was crystal clear. "What are you doing here?" Hess's voice filled the silent conference room. The silent federal current had surfaced, and it was about to wash away every lie Officer Hess had told. The atmosphere in the federal conference room was one of intense, sterile focus. There was no commentary, no exclamations of shock. There was only the methodical work of deconstruction. The lead FBI agent, a woman named Chen, operated the controls, pausing the video with precise clicks of the mouse. The U.S. Attorney's paralegal typed, his fingers flying across the keyboard, creating a transcript that was synchronized with the video's timestamp down to the 10th of a second. On the left screen, Hess's report glowed with its official, self-assured prose. On the right screen, the truth played out in living color. The discrepancies were not just minor, they were chasms. Report. Subject was evasive and hostile from the first moment of contact. Video. Timestamp 0032. Arthur's voice is perfectly calm. "I'm returning library books, officer." He makes no hostile movements. His hands are resting on his wheels. Report. "I observed furtive movements toward the vehicle, consistent with concealing or retrieving a weapon." Video. Timestamp 0114. Agent Chen paused the video. "Show me the furtive movement," she said to the room. They rewound the footage and watched again in slow motion. Arthur's hands moved only once, to slowly retrieve his wallet as he had announced he would. There were no other movements. The claim was a complete fabrication. Report. Subject made verbal threats, referencing connections to federal agencies in an attempt to intimidate. Video. Timestamp 0845. The paralegal read from his transcript. Arthur Corrigan, the agency I worked for, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Arthur Corrigan, retired. Was that a threat? Chen asked the young assistant U.S. attorney in the room. It was a statement of fact, the attorney replied without looking up from his notepad. It was made in response to the officer's direct and repeated questioning about his background and injury. The subject's tone was factual, not threatening. The most damning portion came next. They synchronized Hess's radio transmission with the body camera footage. Radio transmission. Timestamp 1102. He's making furtive movements. Subject claimed to have a weapon earlier in the encounter. Video. At that exact moment, the body camera shows Arthur sitting perfectly still, his face pale with pain, his hands gripping his armrests. He had said nothing about a weapon at any point in the entire recording. Then came the centerpiece of the prosecution's future case. Report. Subject used his wheelchair as a battering ram, rolling it aggressively toward my person. I utilized an approved open-hand control technique to redirect the subject's momentum. Video. Timestamp 1018. The footage is undeniable. Agent Chen played it 3 times. The wheelchair is stationary. Hess is the aggressor. He grabs the handles and shoves. The camera lurches with the movement. Arthur's gasp of pain is sharp and clear on the audio track. The second shove is just as clear. Is that an approved control technique? The AUSA asked dryly. Agent Chen shook her head. That's called assault. They watched the entire video, from the moment Hess stepped out of his car to the moment Sergeant Thorne arrived. They cross-referenced it with the dash cam from Officer Miller's car, which showed Hess pacing and gesticulating wildly before she even got out of her vehicle. They listened to the dispatch tapes, where his voice was tight with panic as he fabricated his lies. By the end of the day, they had a perfect minute-by-minute timeline of the event. It was a story not of a dangerous suspect, but of a police officer who initiated a baseless stop, harassed and insulted a disabled man, and then assaulted him when his authority was questioned. To cover his tracks, he had filed a false report and made false statements on a recorded radio channel. The young AUSA closed his notepad. We have a clear violation of Section 242, willful deprivation of rights under color of law, he said, and filing a false report to federal investigators, which this officially became the moment we requested it, is a separate felony. I think we have enough to proceed. Agent Chen nodded. I'll draw up the arrest warrant. There would be no more quiet internal reviews. No slaps on the wrist. The deconstruction of the lie was complete. The only thing that remained was the consequence. Dean Hess was not sleeping well. For a week he had been relegated to the records room, a purgatory of filing and data entry. The silence from the command staff was deafening. Sergeant Thorne barely looked at him. Officer Miller avoided him entirely. He told himself it was standard procedure, that the investigation would run its course and he would be cleared. He repeated the lies from his report to himself so many times that he was beginning to believe them. He clung to the idea that the system he was part of would protect him. He was asleep when they came. The sun had not yet risen. A pale gray light filtered through his bedroom window. There was no loud banging on the door, no shouting, just a firm, polite knock. 3 raps, a pause, then 3 more. It was the knock of men who were in no hurry, men who knew the person inside was not going anywhere. Hess stumbled out of bed, pulling on a pair of sweatpants, his mind foggy with sleep. He assumed it was a neighbor with an emergency, or maybe a prank. He opened the front door and his blood ran cold. 2 men stood on his porch. They were not wearing police uniforms. They were dressed in dark, conservative suits, their expressions neutral, their posture relaxed but radiating an unmistakable aura of authority. One of them held up a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification. The gold letters seemed to gleam in the dim morning light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Dean Hess?" the first agent asked, his voice calm and professional. Hess could only nod, his mouth suddenly dry as sand. "You are under arrest," the agent stated simply, as if he were commenting on the weather. He did not read him his rights from a card, he recited them from memory, each word delivered with practiced precision. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the words washed over him, Hess's world tilted on its axis. This wasn't internal affairs. This wasn't the local DA. This was the FBI, on his doorstep, at dawn. He looked past the agents and saw not Oak Ridge police cars, but two dark, unmarked sedans parked at the curb. The system wasn't protecting him. A much bigger, more powerful system had targeted him, and it did not miss. There's a mistake," he stammered, the words feeling weak and foolish as soon as they left his mouth. "There's no mistake," the second agent said just as calmly. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The feel of the cold steel handcuffs closing around his wrists was a shock to his system. He had put those same cuffs on hundreds of people. He had never imagined he would one day be on the receiving end. The metallic click was the sound of his career, his identity, and his freedom ending. They walked him to one of the sedans, the neighbors' curtains twitching in the houses across the street. As they placed him in the back seat, he saw his own service weapon and badge being handed over to one of the agents by his wife, who stood crying in the doorway. The items were placed in an evidence bag. As the car pulled away from the curb, Dean Hess looked at his house, his neighborhood, his life, all of it receding in the rearview mirror. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light on the world he had just been forcibly ejected from. He had thought his badge made him powerful, but in the quiet, efficient actions of the federal agents, he was learning a lesson about true power. His was temporary, conditional, and easily revoked. Theirs was absolute. The arrest wasn't just a procedure, it was a message. The silent current had reached its destination. The federal courtroom was a cold and imposing space, all dark wood and marble. It was a place designed to diminish the individual and elevate the law. Dean Hess sat at the defense table, wearing an ill-fitting suit, a stark contrast to the crisp uniform he had worn with such arrogance. He looked smaller, paler, and profoundly out of his depth. The prosecution, led by the young, sharp assistant U.S. attorney, built its case not on emotional testimony, but on a single, unimpeachable witness: the body camera video. "The government calls its first and primary witness to the stand," the AUSA announced to the silent courtroom. "The digital video recording from the body-worn camera of the defendant, Mr. Hess." There was no dramatic opening statement. There was no need. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and the large screen on the wall flickered to life. For the next 20 minutes, the jury watched the incident unfold in real time, from Hess's perspective. They heard his accusatory first words. They heard Arthur Corrigan's calm, patient replies. They heard Hess mock Arthur's unseen injury. The AUSA would periodically ask the technician to pause the video. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he would say, his voice even, "please note the subject's hands. Are they making any furtive movements as claimed in the defendant's report?" On the screen, Arthur's hands rested peacefully on his lap. He played the moment Hess sneered, "What, you trip over a mop handle at the post office?" The words, ugly and dripping with contempt, echoed in the quiet room. He played the moment Arthur revealed his past with the FBI. The AUSA paused it again. Does the subject's tone sound threatening, or does it sound like a man answering a question he has been asked repeatedly? Then came the climax, the moment of the assault. The AUSA had the technician play it at regular speed, then again in slow motion. The jury saw Hess's hands grab the wheelchair handles. They saw the violent shove. They saw Arthur's body jolt, his face contort in pain. They heard his gasp, The raw, unedited reality of the act was sickening. There was no redirecting momentum. There was no control technique. It was a man in a position of power physically brutalizing a disabled man who posed no threat. Finally, the AUSA played Hess's frantic radio calls, juxtaposed with the video of what was actually happening. The lies were laid bare for everyone to see. When the video ended and the lights came back up, a heavy silence hung over the courtroom. The unblinking eye of the camera had told a story more powerful than any witness could. Arthur Corrigan was called to the stand. He did not speak with anger or seek vengeance. He simply recounted the facts, his testimony aligning perfectly with the video evidence. He described the pain, but more than that, he described the feeling of being targeted, of being demeaned, of having his dignity stripped away by a man in a uniform. When it was the defense's turn, their case crumbled. Hess took the stand and tried to stick to the story from his report, but under the prosecutor's precise, surgical cross-examination, his narrative fell apart. "Officer Hess," the AUSA asked, "in the video, we see you shove Mr. Corrigan's chair. In your report, you state he was using it as a battering ram. Can you point to the moment in the video where the wheelchair is moving toward you?" Hess stammered. "Well, you can't see the whole thing. The camera angle." "It's your camera, Mr. Hess. It sees what you see. Let's watch it again." The video played once more. The lie was exposed again and again. The jury watched, their faces grim and set. They had seen the truth. The trial lasted less than 3 days. The jury's deliberation took less than an hour. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and looked not at Hess, but at the judge. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Dean Hess, guilty." The guilty verdict landed in the silent courtroom not with a crash, but with the heavy, final thud of a door swinging shut. Dean Hess didn't react at first. He simply stared forward, his face ashen. The complex structure of lies and self-justification he had built around himself had been systematically dismantled, leaving him exposed and utterly defeated. The law he had once wielded as a weapon had turned and judged him. Sentencing took place a month later. The judge, a woman known for her stern demeanor and sharp intellect, looked down at Hess from the bench. Her voice was not raised, but every word carried the immense weight of her authority. "Mr. Hess, you took an oath to uphold the law and protect all citizens," she began. "Instead, you chose to target a man based on his disability, which you perceived as a weakness. You used your badge not as a shield for the public, but as a cover for your own prejudice and aggression. You traded your honor for a fleeting moment of power, and in doing so, you failed your community, you failed your fellow officers, and you failed the very Constitution you swore to defend." The sentence was severe. 7 years in a federal penitentiary. No possibility of parole for the first 5. A permanent ban from ever serving in law enforcement or possessing a firearm again. As the U.S. Marshals stepped forward to lead a now convicted felon out of the courtroom, the career of Dean Hess was officially over, not with a quiet retirement, but with the clank of shackles. A civil suit filed by Arthur was settled out of court by the city for a substantial sum, a final, expensive admission of their failure to properly train and supervise their officer. Outside, the press clamored for a statement, but Arthur Corrigan, seated in his wheelchair beside his lawyer, simply shook his head. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a profound sense of weariness and a quiet, somber relief that the system, for once, had worked as it was supposed to. Why did this happen? What drove a man like Dean Hess to throw away his career over a pointless confrontation in a library parking lot? The answer likely lies in a deep-seated insecurity, a personality flaw that is dangerously common in professions that grant authority. Hess likely saw the world as a constant struggle for dominance. His badge was not a tool for service, but a shortcut to respect he felt he couldn't earn otherwise. When he saw Arthur, he didn't see a person. He saw an easy target, a chance to affirm his own power over someone he deemed lesser. When Arthur failed to display the expected fear and deference, and then revealed a history that dwarfed Hess's own authority, Hess's entire self-image was threatened. His aggression was not the action of a confident officer, but the desperate flailing of a man terrified of being seen as small. His cruelty was a shield for his own fragility. Could Arthur have handled it differently? Perhaps. Had he immediately mentioned his FBI credentials, the encounter might have ended before it began. But why should he have to? Why should any citizen, regardless of their background, be forced to present special qualifications just to be treated with basic dignity? Had there been no body camera, no witness with a cell phone, the outcome could have been tragically different. It would have been Hess's detailed, fabricated report against the word of a disabled man, and history shows us who usually wins that contest. The cameras, both the official and the civilian, were the great equalizers. They forced a reckoning with the truth that could not be dismissed or buried in a file cabinet. This story is a stark reminder that accountability is rarely given freely. It must often be captured, recorded, and demanded. We hope this story served as a powerful reminder of the importance of justice and integrity. Every interaction, no matter how small, matters. What did you think of Officer Hess's motivations? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone in authority seemed to be acting on prejudice rather than facts? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in stories where the truth prevails, please consider subscribing for more content.